Hi, Ziad. It's great to have you with us today. Thank you so much for joining. So, the Middle East is at an economic crossroads right now. We're seeing unusual dynamics in global oil markets with falling demand, rising supply, and prices under pressure, all while the region navigates ongoing geopolitical tensions and ambitious economic transformation agendas. And you've been covering these shifts extensively as chief emerging markets economist for Bloomberg Economics. So I'm really eager to get your perspective on what's driving these changes and what they mean for the region's future. So I'd like us to start with the geopolitical backdrop. The recent Gaza ceasefire notwithstanding, the Middle East has been in war for nearly 2 years. What are the key economic lessons from this war, Ziad?
Well, good morning, Noor, and thank you so much for having me. I think if I think about the state of war in the Middle East for the past 2 years and the economic lessons from that, I think there is one big economic lesson, which is also a surprise, which is basically that markets have decoupled from geopolitics. So, for example, if you had told me on October 6, 2023, that there would be a war in the Middle East, that the war would last for more than 2 years, that more than 67,000 people would be killed, that the Red Sea would be largely closed to international traffic, that Israel and Iran would engage in a direct 12-day war in which they hit each other's capitals, that the US would bomb Iranian nuclear facilities, that Israeli strikes would take place in Doha in Qatar, just a few kilometers away from the largest US military base in the Middle East. If you had told me any of these things would happen, I would tell you that, I would have expected oil prices to basically increase and go through the roof. What did we get instead? We got not just one of these events, all of them. And how it happened to oil prices? They're $20 lower today, more than $20 lower today than they were on October 6, 2023. I think this is the big lesson that we've had from the war in the last 2 years, that we can geopolitical sort of events can escalate beyond any imagination and any risk that we could have imagined. And yet, oil prices could remain moderate, which limits the impact from the regional spillover and the regional geopolitical spillover to the global economy.
Sorry. So I wanted to actually, because you're bringing in the oil market dimension, and I wanted to ask you about a somewhat unusual pattern that we're seeing in oil markets right now, Ziad, because consumption is at its lowest level in several years. And yet OPEC Plus is ramping up production. The International Energy Association even projects that in 2026 could see one of the largest supply gluts in history. And we're already seeing this with unsold Middle Eastern cargoes accumulating. As a result, oil prices, which had been trading between $70 and $90 a barrel, have started to decline. And this comes at a very critical time, especially for a country like Saudi Arabia, with its Vision 2030, which requires significant funding to diversify the economy into sectors like tourism, real estate development, mining, and high-tech manufacturing. And I read somewhere that in the IMF, in one of its reports, it estimated that the oil price required to balance Saudi Arabia's budget has climbed to around $96 per barrel. So, Ziad, why would Saudi Arabia endorse an approach that risks lowering government revenues and income? How do you explain this decision within its broader economic and political and geopolitical strategy?
So you're absolutely right, Noor. There are a couple of observations that you highlighted, and they're absolutely right. The first one is that OPEC Plus have reversed their sort of oil strategy. Before April this year, they were aiming to curb supply in order to boost prices and maximize their revenue. Since April, they've been increasing their supply targets, trying to flood the market. So that's the first observation. The second observation is that, yes, the biggest OPEC Plus producer and the de facto leader, one of the de facto leaders of the OPEC Plus group is Saudi Arabia. And it has, it's spending a lot, and spending needs require higher oil prices. And our own estimates suggest that, yes, for the government to balance its budget, it needs oil in the 90s. And that's not just it, because if you take into account the domestic investments that the sovereign wealth fund is doing inside Saudi Arabia, and you take that into, that also requires oil prices to fund, then we're talking about oil above 100 for Saudi Arabia to fund all the spending. So yes, the OPEC Plus has changed its strategy towards flooding the market, which obviously has the impact is that lowers prices, and yet the de facto leader, Saudi Arabia, has large spending needs, and it requires a higher oil price to meet his spending needs. So what could explain this sort of puzzle? Let me start by let me start by saying we don't know for sure what is driving this, but let me rule out some possible explanations. So in April, when OPEC Plus did what it did, but reversing the strategy and started increasing production targets, they said that's to punish cheaters within the group, countries like Kazakhstan and Iraq that have been producing above their quota, and the idea was just to punish these cheaters. I don't think that explanation is valid anymore. OPEC Plus is going beyond that. Some of these countries, for example, like Kazakhstan, said we can't adjust our oil production because it's produced by foreign companies and not by the government. So that explanation doesn't hold. The second explanation is that OPEC Plus is trying to maximize revenue, and I don't think that holds either. A
Mm.
key observation or key regularity in the oil market is that your revenue depends on the amount you produce and the oil price. And if you increase output, yes, that might increase revenues if oil prices remain constant, but they don't remain constant. They tend to fall, and they tend to fall by a higher percentage than the increase in your volumes. So revenues tend to fall when you increase output. So it's not about punishing cheaters. It's not about maximizing revenue. So what are the other plausible reasons? I think there are sort of four into two sets. The first set is there might be some economic motivations. One of them is that OPEC Plus is trying to regain market share. You have a lot of production that's coming from the US, from Canada, from Brazil, from Guyana, and a lot of the OPEC Plus producers have cost advantage, and they want to regain that market share. They want to have a larger share of the global oil market than these countries. So that's a plausible economic motivation. The second one is that OPEC Plus may know something that we don't know. You mentioned the IEA's, the International Energy Agency forecasts, and they expect basically the next year in 2026, the market will see one of the largest supply gluts in the last 30 years. But OPEC is more bullish about oil demand, and it thinks oil demand will grow faster than the IEA's forecast. And maybe OPEC knows something that the IEA doesn't, and that's what's motivating their higher supply. So these are two plausible economic reasons. There are also political and geopolitical reasons. It could be the case that OPEC Plus expects some outages among some producers. Excuse me. And the obvious ones here are Iran and Russia, because they're engaged in a war. And maybe OPEC Plus is trying to preempt that by producing more in order to preempt these potential outages, especially from these two countries. The
So,
other ge
mm,
Sorry. The final geopolitical reason, and again, we don't know for sure, is that maybe some of the leaders of the group are trying to please President Trump. President Trump is known; his views are fairly clear. I went through all his tweets in his first term, the 23,000 of them, and this one thing that's very obvious is he likes lower oil prices. And it's no coincidence that the OPEC Plus group started increasing production targets after Trump's inauguration. And maybe that's one reason to basically gain geopolitical advantage with the US administration, especially when we know that the Saudi crown prince is heading to the US in November. So I think among the plausible explanations, we don't know which one is for sure. It could be a combination of these. There's the market share, there's maybe the fact that OPEC Plus thinks that demand is going to be stronger than the other people think. There's maybe preempting potential outages in some countries, and maybe it's a way to basically get on the good side of Trump.
okay, so we can think of several explanations, but we don't know for sure which one is valid. But I wanted to ask you, Ziad, about how a sustained decline in oil prices might affect oil exporting MENA economies. And here I'd like us to focus on two categories of countries. So we have the GCC countries, which are using oil revenues to diversify their economies. And then we have a country like Iraq, and you also work and write on Iraq, and that's why I wanted to ask you about it, because Iraq remains heavily dependent on oil, and the Iraqi government hasn't really undertaken a policy to decrease dependency on oil. So how would a country like Iraq be affected by the declining oil prices? And what differences do you expect in how these economies, like the GCC versus Iraq, would absorb or adapt to a prolonged period of lower oil prices?
So you're absolutely right, Noor. If you focus on the GCC and Iraq, which are key oil producers, the general principle is that lower oil prices are bad for these countries. It reduces revenue, it reduces export revenue, and for countries that run surpluses, lower the surpluses. For some countries, things might turn into deficits. But I don't think there are two categories. I think there are three categories among this group of seven countries. Um, I think the first category is countries like Qatar, like the UAE, and like Kuwait. There's massive hydrocarbon wealth, small populations, they run large surpluses. A reduction in oil prices is inconvenient, but it doesn't cause crisis because there's so much surpluses and wealth and accumulation of wealth. So there's no issue there. There's the other extreme, which are countries that are more vulnerable or the most vulnerable to the oil price declines. And I'd name two actually. You've mentioned Iraq, and I'll talk about Iraq in a bit, but also Bahrain. Bahrain, if you look at the IMF projections, it expects public debt to GDP ratio in Bahrain by 2030 to be around 160%. Just for context, this is the third largest, first highest ratio in the world. The first two are Japan and Singapore. And for Japan, it's a country that is an advanced economy, that's a safe haven, that issues debt in its local currency. The central bank buys its debt. It's not an issue like Bahrain. For Singapore, public debt is just a mirage. The government issues debt in order for asset managers and pension funds to invest in, and has humongous amount of assets and wealth outside that. So the fact that public debt is high does not reflect the robustness of the economy. So in effect, Bahrain would be by 2030, in effect, the country with the highest public debt in the world. And that's an issue. If you look at financial markets, you don't see that the financial markets are panicking about Bahrain. I think because they're basically factoring in an assumption that if Bahrain gets into trouble, it will be bailed out by its neighbors. So that's the first country that's most exposed to oil. The second one is the one you mentioned, Iraq. And Iraq, every time oil prices dropped in recent years, Iraq got into trouble. We've had three oil price declines in the last 20 years. 2008 and 9, Iraq got into trouble, went to the IMF. 2014-16, again, Iraq got into trouble, went to the IMF. And 2020, with the pandemic, Iraq got into so much trouble that it had to devalue the currency to make ends meet. Have things improved since 2020? No. The government is spending more on public sector salaries and wages and pensions, which are not easy to reverse and not easy to delay, and has to meet them. Otherwise, there are not just economic consequences, but also social and political consequences. Our own estimates is that if oil prices remain above $53 per barrel, Iraq would be able to cover this wage and pension bill. If they drop below, then Iraq would have an issue covering this bill. We're not there yet. Oil prices are still above that threshold. But if the IEA is right and we're heading into a market with huge amount of supply glut, then we might get closer to that threshold. So there's sort of the countries that are extremely safe, the UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait. There are countries that are vulnerable, like Bahrain and Iraq, and in the middle is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, runs large deficits, significant deficits. It needs oil near $100 per barrel to meet its spending needs. Um, and basically, what we're seeing in Saudi Arabia these days is that the kingdom is basically trying to cut spending in order to, adjust to the environment of lower oil prices. You see that in some sectors. If you talk, for example, to certain people working in consulting and other areas, you're seeing that the effect of the Saudi spending cuts is hitting some of these sectors.
But I want to ask you a follow-up question on this, Ziad, because we've been reading a lot about this. We've been hearing a lot about this. But how would this, do you think, affect Saudi citizens, especially now with inflation rates, high inflation rates, very high housing prices? How is this affecting the social contract in Saudi Arabia? Because there's we're like we feel like there's a new social contract being engineered by the political elite in Saudi Arabia. And how do you think would lower oil prices and thus less lower government revenues affect Saudi citizens and their relations with the state?
I mean, there's a fairly clear social contract in all these countries that export oil.
Mm.
At least in the GCC, the social contract is fairly clear. The government provides citizens with economic benefits. In returns, the citizens provide the government with basically political obedience, and you have basically absolute monarchies in these countries. What makes the social contract works is the fact that oil funds all of it in order for the government to provide economic benefits and not rely on citizens for its revenues and for its spending. It does require an external source of revenue, which is oil, which is which funds the social contract. An environment with lower oil prices would make meeting these economic benefits and spending more challenging. So I think there's a couple of things here. If you look at past oil downturns, and this is the ones we're currently in is not the first, and so far it's not the worst either. Then how did the government in Saudi and other countries adjust to lower oil prices? Well, they did something fairly clear. They started cutting capital expenditure. So they maintained salaries and wages because they are the core of the social contract, but they cut capital expenditure. And in Saudi Arabia, and in other countries, the same might happen. There's only one difference right now, which is basically Saudi Arabia has committed to hosting a number of high-profile global events,
Yeah.
from the Asian World Cup in 2027 to the Asian Winter Games in 2029, where they have to build a ski resort in Neom, to the Expo, to the World Expo in 2030, to the Football World Cup, FIFA World Cup in 2034. And if you know anything from historical experience, for example, the experience of Qatar in hosting the World Cup, is that these hosting these events is costly. Building the infrastructure ahead of the games would cost a lot. Saudi is doing that, just doing a larger World Cup than Qatar over a larger sort of geography, and therefore that is proven that could prove to be costly, and therefore the capacity to cut capital expenditure when oil prices decline, there's less room for maneuver this time versus previous previous oil price shocks. Um, I forgot the second thing I wanted to say, but maybe
It's okay. Maybe in your answer to the other question. So basically, we have so far covered key economic lessons from the war on Gaza, and we also discussed the shifts in the oil market and expectations for the future. I'd like us now turn to the global dimension, Ziad, which you also cover as well in your writings with Bloomberg Economics. So US President Donald Trump's policies are redefining the global economy. How is Trumponomics playing out in the Middle East, Ziad? Who are the winners and the losers from Trump's economic policies?
So the way I think about the Middle East relationship with the world is that I think that the Middle East gives the world three inputs and receives from the world three prices. The Middle East gives the world energy, it's still an important energy producer, oil and gas. It gives the world capital. There's still a lot of investments going from the Middle East into the world, especially through sovereign wealth funds. And that was the second thing I wanted to talk about, but I'm not going to go back. And the third thing that the Middle East gives the world is trade routes. Places like the Suez Canal, the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, the Strait of Hormuz. These are important for global trade. What does it receive from the world? It receives from the world three prices: the price of oil, interest rates, which is the price of money, and the price of exchange rate. The dollar is important for the region. So when I think about when something happens in the Middle East, I want to analyze its impact on the world. I think about the three inputs that the Middle East provides to the world. When something happens globally, and I want to analyze the impact on the Middle East, I look at the three prices that the Middle East gets from the world. So you're right. Trumponomics has basically is trying to reshape the world and the global economy. How does that impact the Middle East? Well, let's look at the three prices that the Middle East gets from the world. What Trumponomics is doing is that it's lowering oil prices, partly through tariffs and partly through the impact on OPEC plus policy. So we're heading into the world where oil prices are falling. Trump is keen on lower interest rates, and the US is lowering interest rates. So we're also heading into a world where interest rates are falling. And for multiple reasons, Trumponomics is also resulting in a weaker dollar. So we're going to the world with lower rates, lower interest rates, lower oil prices, and a weaker dollar. And for our region, that creates winners and losers. Who are the losers? If you're an oil producer and oil prices are falling, that is an issue. And yes, lower interest rates are good for you, but they're not enough to offset the impact of lower oil prices. But if you're an oil importing country, and oil prices are falling, that lowers your import bill. That's great for you. And if you're an oil importing country that borrows from global markets and interest rates are falling in global markets, perfect. That is a very that's a friendly environment to you. So who are these economies that import oil and go and borrow from the global markets? Well, we have a few of them in the region. There is Egypt, there is Jordan, there's Tunisia. And for a country like, let's just take Egypt, for example, I think Egyptian policymakers would prefer living in a world in 2025 where global growth is slowing. There's a bit of uncertainty, but interest rates are declining because it tells them go and seek funding from abroad uh, quite cheaply, and their import bill of energy declines. They prefer that world to the world we had in 2022 when the global economy was booming, but inflation was running hot, and the US was raising interest rates rapidly, and that basically exposed Egypt and in my view, was one of the triggers of the currency crisis that the country went through in 2022 to 2024. So I think in terms of the winners, all importers that borrow from global markets, places like Jordan, Egypt, Tunisia, and even if you widen the region, Turkey, and the losers are basically the oil producers with different degrees of exposure, as we've talked about.
Thank you, Ziad. So I'd like us to bring in China to this discussion of the global and geopolitical landscape because we're witnessing the consolidation of a more multipolar world with China playing an increasingly central role. So China is now the largest importer of Gulf oil and gas, and it provides a vital source of market stability for GCC countries. And at the same time, these countries, the GCC countries, remain under the US security umbrella and they continue to rely on Western investment and technology. So, how do you think are GCC countries navigating this balancing act between their deepening economic ties with China and their enduring security dependence on the US? Or even more broadly, what does this emerging multipolarity mean for their long term strategic positioning in the world?
Yeah. So the relationship between the GCC, China, and the US used to be simple. It used to be a simple triangle of energy, manufacturing, and debt.
Mhm.
So the GCC used to provide China and the US with energy. China would take energy and other raw materials and turn them into manufactured goods that exports to the rest of the world. The US would buy both these manufactured goods from China as well as energy and raw materials from the region and other places with debt. So there was a neat division of labor, but there's only one problem with it, is that no one was happy with that arrangement. The GCC was not happy with this dependence on energy and oil, and they wanted to diversify into other products. China wanted to pivot its economy from manufacturing and exports to more consumption and services, and the US was unhappy with its external oil dependence and its trade deficits. And what changed? The US decided to basically shake that arrangement. It did that through two things. One is the shale oil revolution in the US, which massively reduced the US dependence on oil from the world. It made the US more self-dependent on energy and oil. And the second thing that it did, which is basically the trade wars. that the US has been engaging in. It started with Trump's first term. Biden's administration did not reverse some of the tariffs on China. And now we're going into an escalated version of that trade war. So where do we stand today? From the GCC perspective, both of them, both China and the US, the two global superpowers, are important. China has overtaken the US as the region's biggest trade partner. It's not just energy, but everything. I think trade with China now stands at 3 times larger than trade with the US. So it is an important economic partner. But the US remains the main security partner for the GCC. If you just don't look at overall trade, you look at defense trade, China's completely absent. The US is very present. And yes, there has been fractures in the security guarantees from the US. It's multiple episodes. The latest one is the Israeli strikes on Doha. But I think that still stands. And I think from the GCC perspective, what they want to do is they want to maintain that relationship. They want to maintain that trade relationship with China. They want to maintain that security relationship with the US. So far, they've been able to do this. If things escalate between the US and China and the two superpowers come to a head, will they ask the GCC to choose side? Possibly. Will the GCC choose sides? Unlikely.
Mm. Thank you so much, Ziad. This was a very insightful discussion. I wish we had more time because I have more questions now than at the beginning. But this was very insightful. You told us a lot about the shifts and the dynamics in the oil market, and then the geopolitical realignment that's happening in the world and how it might affect the region. We talked about the winners and the losers. So I hope we get the chance to do another follow-up interview with you in the future. But thank you so much for joining us, and thank you everyone for listening to this video.